in Southampton County, Virginia, during the sweltering, breath-stealing heat of August 1831. 57 white residents lost their lives within just 48 hours. The official records list their names, their ages, their supposed final moments. But what those same records never breathe a word about is how everything began. How the spark that ignited the bloodiest slave uprising in American history wasn't rage at first, but scripture. How a man who secretly taught himself to read from a stolen Bible became the unlikely architect of that revolt. How the son of an African-born woman, a woman marked with ritual scars from her homeland, transformed prophecy into revolution. For decades, the Commonwealth of Virginia did everything possible to smother this story under layers of courtroom testimony and propaganda. They hanged 16 men. They sold dozens more into the Deep South. They rewrote the narrative of those 2 days until it fit the version they wanted the world to remember. But surviving court documents, private letters, and long-hidden witness statements, many locked away for more than a century, reveal something far more complicated than the blunt tale of senseless, violent authorities insisted upon. Before we continue with the story of Nathaniel Turner, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. Stories like this, stories that upend everything we thought we understood about American history, deserve to be heard. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Together, let's uncover the truth powerful people work so hard to bury. What truly happened in Southampton County didn't begin on that August night. It began 31 years earlier, inside a cramped cabin where a woman looked down at her newborn son and burst into tears. Nancy Turner delivered her child on October 2nd, 1800. In a roughly hewn cabin on Benjamin Turner's plantation. The birth itself was ordinary. In Virginia's autumn, countless enslaved children entered the world under similar conditions. But what happened immediately afterward shaped everything that would follow. Nancy had been taken from Africa as a young girl, and the traditional scar patterns of her people still marked her arms. She examined her infant son with an intensity that unsettled the older women assisting her. Her fingers traced over his skull, his chest, his tiny limbs, as though searching for a sign only she could recognize. "He carries the marks," she whispered in a tongue the other enslaved women did not fully understand. "The bumps, the scars. He is chosen." The women exchanged anxious glances. They knew what happened when an enslaved mother claimed supernatural destiny for her child. Slaveholders tolerated no such talk. But Nancy was adamant that her son had been born with unusual markings, signs she recognized from the spiritual traditions of her homeland. Whether these marks truly existed, or whether they were the desperate hope of a mother trying to find meaning in a hopeless life, no one could say. But Nancy believed with unshakable certainty, and she raised Nathaniel with that conviction woven into every moment of his childhood. Benjamin Turner, the plantation owner, was a prosperous enough farmer who worked alongside roughly a dozen enslaved people. He wasn't the cruelest master, nor was he remotely kind. He belonged to that vast middle ground of men who viewed slavery as a practical necessity. No excessive brutality, but no moral hesitation either. His wife, Elizabeth, noticed early on that Nancy's son was not like the other enslaved children. While others played in the dirt or carried out small chores, Nathaniel spent hours sitting alone, studying the shape of leaves, the movement of shadows, the deliberate paths of insects across the earth. When Nathaniel was 3 or 4, he demonstrated an ability that rippled uneasily through both the slave quarters and the big house. He began describing events that happened before he was born, so specifically, so confidently, that older slaves swore he must have somehow witnessed them. He spoke of the year a storm ruined the tobacco fields, of the exact spot where a horse broke its leg, of conversations between people who had died long before his birth. His grandmother, Bridget, Nancy's mother, who still carried the African name she refused to give up, nurtured the strange ability, seeing it as proof of Nancy's prophecy. "The boy sees what others cannot," she whispered. "The ancestors speak through him." Benjamin Turner heard the stories and, with the idle curiosity of a man intrigued by his own property, decided to teach the boy how to read. This was illegal in Virginia, The law had banned teaching enslaved people to read since 1819. Turner ignored that. Perhaps he was amused by Nathaniel's intelligence. Perhaps he believed, in some vague Christian sense, that literacy was a blessing. Either way, he gave the boy access to the family Bible and watched as Nathaniel consumed it with an intensity bordering on obsession. By age 12, Nathaniel read and wrote better than many white children in the county. But even more unsettling was the way he interpreted Scripture. In the Old Testament, he did not see mere spiritual stories. He saw patterns, symbols, and strategies. The Israelites fleeing Egypt, David defeating Goliath, Samson bringing down the Philistine temple. To Nathaniel, these weren't ancient myths. They were instructions waiting for the right moment. Enslaved people began coming to him quietly, asking him to explain Scripture. They called him the prophet in hushed voices, careful never to let the overseers hear. Nathaniel told them God had shown him visions of black and white spirits clashing in the heavens, visions of rivers turning red, visions of liberation through fire and judgment. He fasted for days, wandered into the woods to pray, and claimed to receive messages directly from the divine. I saw white spirits and black spirits locked in battle, he would later testify. The sun went dark. Thunder shook the heavens. Blood flowed in streams. In 1810, Benjamin Turner died, and the plantation passed to his son, Samuel. Nathaniel, now 10 years old, watched as the estate was reorganized. Samuel had no intention of continuing his father's strange experiment with an educated slave. To him, Nathaniel represented danger. Too smart, too admired by the others, too assured in the way he carried himself. But Nathaniel was also valuable, strong, capable, profitable. So Samuel Turner kept him close, put him to work in the fields like everyone else, and watched him with a wary, calculating eye. During these years, Nathaniel's reputation spread far beyond plantation where he lived. Enslaved people from neighboring farms would invent excuses to pass through the area, hoping to catch him preaching. He told them that God had revealed a powerful purpose for his life, that he had been chosen to guide his people toward freedom, but that the appointed hour had not yet come. He was waiting for a sign, a clear and unmistakable message from heaven. I was set apart for some great work in the hands of the Almighty, he would say to anyone willing to listen. The signs will be shown to me when the time is right. In 1822, when Nathaniel was 22, Samuel Turner died unexpectedly, and his estate was reorganized once again. Nathaniel was not sold outright. Instead, he was hired out to John Travis, a wheelwright who had married Samuel's widow. Being hired out rather than sold granted Nathaniel a rare degree of movement. He worked in Travis's shop, learning the wheelwright's trade, but he also traveled across Southampton County, delivering completed work. This freedom allowed him to maintain the spiritual and social network he had been quietly building for years. Life in the Travis household was smaller and far less controlled. Nathaniel found more time to preach, more time to think, more time to wait for whatever sign God intended to send. He married a woman named Cherry, enslaved on a nearby plantation, and the pain of their forced separation, seeing her only when Travis allowed it, deepened his simmering grief and strengthened his sense of divine injustice. He watched families torn apart at the auction block, watched children ripped from their mothers' arms, watched men whipped bloody for trivial infractions. Each cruelty fed the fire of his belief that judgment would soon fall. By 1825, while working the fields, Nathaniel experienced what he described as a profound religious vision. He claimed he saw drops of blood on the corn blades, strange symbols like hieroglyphs, and numbers written in blood on the leaves and surrounding woods. Whether these were real markings, tricks of sunlight, natural plant disease, blood from his own work-worn hands, or hallucinations brought on by fasting and spiritual intensity, no one could know. But Nathaniel interpreted them as messages directly from God. The Almighty was preparing him for his mission. He began baptizing followers in the mill pond, performing ceremonies that blended Christian rituals with fragments of African spiritual traditions passed down through his grandmother. White residents occasionally witnessed these gatherings from a distance, and the scenes unsettled them, The vehement singing, the impassioned prayers, the way the enslaved community looked at Nathaniel was something close to reverence. But Southampton County had always been relatively quiet, lacking the organized resistance found in other parts of the South. White residents considered these religious meetings harmless, perhaps even useful for keeping the enslaved population focused on heaven rather than rebellion. They could not have been more mistaken. On February 12, 1831, the sun vanished at midday. A solar eclipse swept across North America, and in Southampton County, both enslaved people and slaveholders stood outdoors, staring upward as the moon slowly devoured the sun. The temperature dropped. Birds fell silent and returned to their roosts. A strange, ghostly twilight settled over the land at noon. Nathaniel Turner stood in the Travis yard, his face lifted toward the sky, tears streaming down his cheeks. This, he believed, was the sign he had been waiting for. After years of visions and prophecies, the message was finally clear. God had spoken. The time had come. It was the sign I had been waiting for, he would later say. I must arise and prepare myself, and slay my enemies with their own weapons. But Nathaniel did not strike immediately. Despite the religious fervor that drove him, he was cautious and strategic. He spent the next 6 months recruiting, planning, and refining his approach. He had identified 4 men he trusted completely: Henry Porter, Hark Travis, Nelson Williams, and Sam Edwards. Their selection was deliberate. Each man was strong, determined, and carried deep personal wounds that made the idea of rebellion irresistible. Henry had watched his wife sold to Georgia 3 years earlier. Hark had been promised freedom by a former master, only to have that promise shattered when a man died and left him to Travis's ownership. Nelson carried scars across his back from a whipping that nearly killed him. Sam had buried 2 of his young children, both dead before the age of 5 from illnesses that might have been treatable had enslaved children received the same medical care as white families. Nathaniel told him about the eclipse, about his visions, about the mandate he believed God had placed upon him. But more importantly, he explained the plan. They would strike on July 4th, America's Independence Day, a date chosen for its biting symbolism. They would begin at the Travis farm, move methodically across the county, gathering more men and more weapons along the way. Their ultimate goal was Jerusalem, the county seat, where they intended to seize the armory and ignite a much larger uprising across Virginia and the entire South. But as July approached, Nathaniel fell ill. Whether it was real sickness, a crisis of faith, or a calculated delay remains a mystery. The planned revolt was postponed. His followers grew restless, unsure whether their prophet had hesitated or whether God had altered the timeline. Then on August 13th, the sky changed again. That day, the sun took on a strange bluish-green cast, likely an atmospheric anomaly, or perhaps the lingering haze of distant fires. From his cabin, weakened by illness and peering through the small window, Nathaniel watched the eerie light fall across Southampton County. To him, this was God's second message. The delay had been part of the divine plan. Now the true moment had arrived. On Sunday, August 21st, Nathaniel met with his 4 trusted followers in the woods near the Travis property. They gathered at a spot they called Cabin Pond, sharing a meal of roasted pig that Hark had stolen from his master's smokehouse. As they ate, 2 additional men approached, Jack Ree and Will Francis. Nathaniel had not summoned them, and their unexpected arrival alarmed him at first. But Hark vouched for both, and Nathaniel allowed them to join. Will Francis stood out immediately. He was enormous, physically imposing, monstrously strong, and he carried a reputation for violence. Years earlier, he had killed an overseer in a neighboring county, yet had somehow escaped execution, instead being sold again and again to men reckless enough to purchase him. Well, Francis had been sold repeatedly because most slaveholders considered him too dangerous to keep. He listened to Nathaniel's plan with a flat, unreadable expression, then asked only one question: "When do we start?" "Tonight," Nathaniel answered. "We begin at my master's house, the Travis farm. We take their weapons first." Then we move on to the neighboring farms. By dawn, we will have an army. They discussed the remaining details as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over the trees. The plan itself was straightforward, but demanded absolute, unwavering commitment. They would strike swiftly and silently, taking weapons and horses from each property. No one who could raise an alarm could be spared. Every white person they encountered, men, women, even children, would be killed. Nathaniel was unflinching in this. His justification was not merely strategic, but theological. God has commanded it, he told them. Just as the Israelites were instructed to destroy the Canaanites completely, they were to eliminate every potential enemy. This is divine judgment, he insisted, not murder. Some of the men shifted uneasily. Killing white men was one thing. Killing overseers or brutal masters could be justified. But women, children, yet Nathaniel's absolute conviction that they were instrument of divine plan overpowered their hesitation. They had committed themselves to this path. There was no turning back. Near midnight, the 7 men moved through the darkness toward the Travis home. The house was quiet, its occupants sound asleep. A dog barked once, then went silent. Nathaniel reached the front door and tested the latch. It opened easily. In Southampton County, most slaveholders didn't bother locking their doors. They believed their slaves were docile, contained. Nathaniel pushed the door open, and the 7 men stepped inside the house where he had lived and worked for nearly 9 years. They crept upstairs toward the bedrooms, moving like shadows through the thick darkness. Joseph Travis, his wife Sarah, their infant son, and Sarah's 3 older children all slept peacefully, unaware that their world was seconds from ending. What followed would later appear in court testimony, newspaper reports, and terrified recollections whispered for generations. The details were so gruesome that even the legal documents softened the descriptions. But the undeniable truth was that within minutes, the entire Travis household lay dead. Nathaniel and his men moved room to room with axes and hatchets. Nathaniel had ordered silence, and gunfire would rouse the neighbors. When they emerged into the yard, their clothing was stained, and several of the men trembled visibly. Some vomited in the grass. But Nathaniel's voice remained steady as he ordered them to search for weapons and horses. They found several guns, ammunition, and 4 horses. Armed and mounted, they rode off toward the nearest farm before first light could reveal what had happened. The rebellion had begun. The group moved through Southampton County at a speed that would later confound military observers. Between midnight and dawn on August 22nd, they attacked 5 more farms. With each assault, their numbers increased. Enslaved people joined them, some eagerly, some reluctantly, and some because staying behind risked being accused as conspirators if the uprising failed. At the Reese farm, they killed 3 residents and gained 4 new recruits. At another Turner farm, unrelated to Nathaniel, they killed 5 and brought 6 more men into the uprising. The pattern repeated property after property. By sunrise, Nathaniel commanded roughly 15 men, armed, mounted, and committed to his plan, even as its moral weight settled heavily on them. This was not random violence. Nathaniel had planned a precise route, hitting farms in a pattern designed to gather as many followers and weapons as possible before word spread. But maintaining discipline grew increasingly difficult. Some of the newest recruits, fueled by years of brutality and anger, wanted to linger at each site to loot or destroy property. Nathaniel repeatedly drove them forward. "We must reach Jerusalem before they can prepare a defense," he insisted. "Every minute we waste is a minute they gain." At the Whitehead farm, they encountered Margaret Whitehead, a young woman who had quietly taught enslaved children to read, define Virginia law. Nathaniel hesitated. She had shown kindness many times. But with Frances did not hesitate. The killing was swift and brutal, and something inside several of the men fractured. They realized they were no longer simply rebels fighting for justice. They were killing indiscriminately, and the line between righteous vengeance and unrestrained violence had blurred beyond recognition. Throughout Monday, August 22nd, their ranks swelled. By afternoon, the group numbered between 50 and 60 men. Accounts vary, as fear and chaos kept anyone from counting accurately. They had killed roughly 60 white residents of Southampton County. Some victims were wealthy plantation owners, known for cruelty. Others were poor farmers who owned no slaves. Still others were children, guilty only of having been born into a race and an era defined by racial hierarchy. The alarm finally spread late that morning when a young boy escaped one of the attacked farms and reached a neighbor's home. Terror traveled faster than horseback. White families fled toward Jerusalem, abandoning their homes and gathering in hopes of safety. The county militia mobilized, and riders were sent to neighboring counties for reinforcements. By Monday afternoon, Nathaniel's force was at its peak, but cracks were widening rapidly. Many of the new recruits were drunk. They had raided liquor stores at several farms. Maintaining order became impossible. The columns stretched for miles, some straggling behind, others galloping recklessly ahead. Nathaniel struggled to regain control, but he was a preacher, not a trained military leader. The uprising was beginning to slip from his grasp. At the Parker farm, roughly 3 miles from Jerusalem, they encountered armed. For the first time, Nathaniel's force met genuine resistance. At the Parker property, a group of white men, perhaps a dozen, had barricaded themselves inside the house and opened fire as the rebels approached. Nathaniel's men had firearms by now, but most had never used them. The exchange was frantic and disorganized. Several of his followers were wounded, and one was killed outright. The white defenders held their position, and Nathaniel made a tactical decision: bypass them and continue toward Jerusalem. But that delay proved costly. More armed white men were assembling, forming militia units with growing coordination. The element of surprise was gone, and the numerical advantage Nathaniel once held meant little against trained defenders with superior weapons and fortified ground. That evening, as darkness settled once more, Nathaniel's group camped in the woods near the Ridley plantation. They had moved in a wide, uneven circle through the county, and now found themselves closer to where they had begun to enter Jerusalem. Morale was collapsing. Some insisted they should push forward no matter the cost. Others argued they should flee, scatter into the forest, slip north, or disappear into the swamps. A few even whispered about surrender, though all understood surrender meant immediate execution. Nathaniel spent the night walking among his men, trying to steady their resolve. He reminded them of the visions, the eclipse, the strange sun, the divine signs he believed had appointed them to this mission. But even to him, his words rang hollow. He knew the truth. The rebellion was failing. The white residents were armed, organized, and enraged. The only advantage they ever had, surprise, had vanished completely. If you're feeling the tension of this moment, when everything Nathaniel Turner planned began to unravel, go ahead and hit the like button and share this video with someone who appreciates true historical mysteries. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories this intense rarely surface. Now, let's see how a rebellion born from prophecy descended into desperate survival. Tuesday morning, August 23rd, brought disaster. Nathaniel tried to regroup what remained of his force and make one final push toward Jerusalem. But overnight, most of his men had slipped away. Some returned to their plantations, hoping to claim they were forced to join. Others fled into the swamps and forests, choosing survival over loyalty. By dawn, Nathaniel commanded fewer than 20 men. They attempted one last attack at the Blunt plantation, hoping to gather weapons and rally more support. But the defenders there were ready. Armed white men had gathered, having heard news and prepared their defense. The battle was brief and hopelessly one-sided. The rebels were overwhelmed and scattered, dissolving into the woods in total disarray. Nathaniel tried desperately to gather whoever was left, but it was too late. By Tuesday afternoon, he was moving through the forest with only a handful of followers, and even they were beginning to wonder whether continuing was worth the inevitable outcome. The rebellion meant to ignite a sweeping uprising across the South had collapsed in less than 48 hours. The white response was immediate, merciless, and overwhelming. Militia units from Southampton, Sussex, Isle of Wight, and Nansemond counties converged from all directions. Federal soldiers arrived from Fort Monroe. Naval patrols sealed off the rivers. Within days, nearly 3,000 armed white men were scouring Southampton County for any rebels. What followed was a reign of terror that, in its own way, rivaled the violence of the uprising itself. White militias killed any black person they suspected, often without evidence, without trial, without hesitation. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 100 and 200 African Americans were slaughtered in the days following the revolt. Many had no connection whatsoever to Nathaniel's rebellion. Some were enslaved people who had stayed loyal to their masters. Others were free black residents entirely uninvolved. Heads were mounted on poles along the roadside. Bodies were mutilated as warnings. The captured rebels were rushed through swift military tribunals. No legal defense was offered, no mercy expected. 16 men were hanged in Jerusalem over the following weeks, their bodies left dangling as public displays. Dozens more were sold into the Deep South, a fate many believed worse than death. The state of Virginia compensated slaveholders for their losses, both for enslaved people who were executed and for white residents who had been killed. But through it all, one absence haunted the county. Nathaniel Turner had vanished. For 6 weeks he eluded capture, slipping through the woods despite an enormous manhunt. He survived on stolen food and whatever he could forage. The authorities were baffled. How could one man hide so effectively in a county swarming with armed pursuers? The answer lay within the very system that had shaped him. Nathaniel knew Southampton County's forests intimately. The footpaths, the ravines, the hollow trees, the small cabins where someone might leave food or issue a quiet warning. More importantly, enslaved people across the region protected him through their silence. They didn't have to support his rebellion, to refuse betraying one of their own. On October 30th, 1831, a farmer named Benjamin Phipps discovered Nathaniel in a cave-like hollow beneath a fallen tree. Nathaniel was unarmed, weakened by hunger and exposure. He surrendered without struggle, perhaps exhausted, perhaps resigned, or perhaps still believing that God might yet intervene. He was taken to Jerusalem in chains, and crowds flooded the streets to see the man who had terrified the county for nearly 2 months. Contemporary accounts describe him as calm, almost peaceful, showing neither fear nor remorse. When asked if he regretted the rebellion, he answered simply, "Was not Christ crucified?" His trial lasted only 1 day. The outcome was predetermined. On November 5th, 1831, Nathaniel Turner was executed by hanging in Jerusalem, Virginia. According to some reports, his body was dissected afterward and pieces distributed as grim souvenirs. His skin was said to have been fashioned into coin purses and book covers. His skull reportedly passed from collector to collector before disappearing from the historical record. But Nathaniel Turner's death did not end the mystery. If anything, it deepened it. His execution closed his life, but not the questions about what his rebellion truly meant, or what it revealed about the nation that both created him and condemned him. In the days before his execution, Nathaniel sat in his jail cell and dictated a story to Thomas Ruffin Gray, a local lawyer who saw in the condemned man an opportunity for profit. Gray published a resulting manuscript under the title The Confessions of Nat Turner, a document that remains one of the most disputed primary sources in American history. Reading Gray's account raises more questions than answers. To what extent are the words truly Nathaniel's? And how much passed through Gray's filter of prejudice, agenda, and commercial ambition? Gray presented the confession as a warning, a demonstration that literacy made enslaved people dangerous. Yet within the text, Nathaniel's voice, assuming it really is his, emerges with unsettling clarity and complexity. You have asked me to give a history of the motives which induced me to undertake the late insurrection. The confession begins. To do so, I must go back to the days of my infancy. Throughout the document, Nathaniel describes his visions with the assurance of someone who genuinely believed he was receiving divine communication. The Holy Spirit appeared to him in the fields. God spoke directly, commanding him to rise against his oppressors. The signs in the sky, the eclipse, the strange color of the sun, were unmistakable divine messages that the appointed hour had come. But interwoven with this religious certainty are moments of cold calculation, careful planning, and deliberate strategy. Nathaniel chose his followers with precision. He mapped out a route designed for maximum impact. He made tactical decisions about timing, targets, and logistics. Was he a religious zealot driven by sincere visions, or a revolutionary who used the language of prophecy to inspire and organize? Most likely, he was both. A man who believed deeply in a divine mandate, yet also possessed the pragmatic mind required to carry it out. Equally telling is what Gray omitted. The published confession barely touches on the daily brutality of slavery, as though bondage were merely background noise rather than the central force shaping Nathaniel's life. Gray had no interest in presenting the uprising as a rational response to oppression. He wanted readers to see Nathaniel as a deranged fanatic. Acknowledging the systemic violence of slavery would have undermined that narrative. Even so, elements of the truth slipped through. Nathaniel describes watching his father escape to freedom when he was a child, never to return. He recalls being prevented from marrying the woman he loved because they were owned by a different man. He alludes to countless humiliations, cruelties, and degradations endured over 30 years. His visions may have been sincere, but they were born in the soil of lifelong dehumanization. The publication of Confessions of Nat Turner sent shockwaves through the South. It sold rapidly, enriching gray and horrifying white Southerners who saw, in the testimony of an articulate and educated enslaved man, a terrifying portrait of potential for organized resistance. The document became the centerpiece of arguments for harsher laws, banning slave literacy, restricting religious gatherings, increasing surveillance, and tightening punishments. But the confession also served as something else. Undeniable proof that enslaved people were not the passive, childlike figures so often imagined by slavery's defenders. Here was a man who read and wrote better than many white Southerners, who quoted scripture like a trained minister, who planned and executed a coordinated military action. His very existence contradicted the ideological foundation of slavery. Virginia responded with a wave of repressive legislation. Laws banning religious meetings among enslaved people were tightened. Penalties for teaching slaves to read became harsher. Free black residents faced new constraints on movement and civil rights. Across the state, the mechanisms of control grew more rigid, with Southampton County offered as the warning of what happened when vigilance weakened. Yet none of these laws addressed the deeper, more unsettling questions provoked by the uprising. Slaveholders began looking at their own enslaved workers with new suspicion. The loyal servant who had lived in their household for years. Could he be plotting? The religious man who preached obedience. Was he gathering followers? The trusted housemaid. Might she one day rise in the night? There were no answers, and that uncertainty proved more terrifying than the uprising itself. Nathaniel Turner had demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of detailed planning, coordinated resistance, and large-scale rebellion. He had shown that the entire slave system depended on a delicate balance of force and fear, one that could be shattered by a single determined individual. In the years that followed, Virginia officials worked systematically to soften, distort, and eventually bury the reality of what happened in Southampton County. Records were altered. Testimonies disappeared. Witness statements were clarified to align with preferred narratives. Inconvenient details were quietly removed from public documents. This process began almost immediately. Governor John Floyd ordered a full review of all materials related to the uprising, ostensibly to understand its causes, but increasingly to control how it would be remembered. As the review progressed, certain testimonies vanished, others were rewritten, and official publications began reflecting a carefully curated version of events. In December 1831, the Virginia General Assembly convened a special session to address the rebellion. Behind closed doors, deep fractures emerged among the state's leadership. Some delegates argued the uprising demonstrated that slavery was fundamentally unstable and ought to be abolished gradually. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, grandson of the former president, proposed a gradual emancipation plan that unexpectedly gained support among Western Virginia representatives who owned few slaves and resented the political dominance of the Eastern plantation elite. But Eastern delegates, the men whose wealth depended on slavery, fought back fiercely. To them, the rebellion was not evidence that slavery was unjust, but that slaves had been granted too much leniency, too much movement, too much preaching, too little surveillance. The solution, they argued, was not to question slavery, but to perfect it. They warned that even discussing emancipation publicly would signal weakness to the enslaved population, inviting future uprisings. The pro-slavery faction won decisively. Not only were all emancipation proposals rejected, but the very record of the debate was intentionally buried. The official legislative journal made only vague, fleeting references to discussions regarding the recent disturbances. Detailed accounts of arguments for gradual emancipation were deliberately excluded from published records. Virginia wanted no written trace that state leaders had ever considered ending slavery, fearing such evidence might embolden abolitionists or ignite hope among the enslaved. The authorized narrative instead emphasized several carefully chosen points. Nathaniel was a religious madman, driven insane by his own intelligence and by the reckless indulgence of masters who taught him to read. The rebellion was portrayed as a meaningless eruption of violence, devoid of legitimate political or social motivation. The rebels were described as savage, irrational figures who killed indiscriminately without plan or purpose. And most importantly, the uprising was framed as completely isolated, supposedly unsupported by the broader slave population, proving, in the state's view, that most enslaved people were content with their condition. This narrative served many purposes at once. It absolved Virginia's slaveholding class of any responsibility for creating conditions that might lead human beings to violent resistance. It strengthened arguments for harsher control while dismissing the idea that enslaved people had valid grievances. It transformed Nathaniel from a revolutionary figure into a cautionary example about the dangers of allowing slaves to read, worship freely, or exercise any intellectual autonomy. The medical community aided this propaganda effort in deeply disturbing ways. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a prominent and widely cited Southern physician, published papers claiming that slaves who escaped or rebelled suffered from invented mental disorders he called drapetomania and dysesthesia ethiopica. These fabricated diagnoses pathologized any desire for freedom, recasting rebellion as mental illness that required treatment, meaning increased labor, physical punishment, and stricter discipline. Nathaniel Turner became a textbook example of these imaginary conditions, his intelligence and leadership reinterpreted as symptoms of disease rather than signs of human capability. Virginia's churches also joined the coordinated effort to reshape the narrative. Ministers preached that the uprising demonstrated the danger of misreading Scripture. They insisted Nathaniel had twisted God's word, and that true Christianity demanded obedience to earthly masters. Sermons highlighted passages about submission and patience, while verses concerning liberation, justice, or deliverance were quietly avoided or reinterpreted beyond recognition. The Virginia Baptist Association even issued formal declarations condemning the rebellion and calling for more religious instruction for slaves. Strictly controlled instruction, taught only by white ministers delivering approved doctrines. But the official narrative could never fully suppress the alternative one that spread among enslaved people across the South. In slave quarters from Virginia to Louisiana, in whispered conversations at night, Nathaniel Turner became something very different. To them, he was a man who had fought back, who had proven resistance was possible, who showed that slaves were not passive objects but could be agents of their own liberation. These oral histories bore little resemblance to Gray's published confession. Among enslaved communities, Nathaniel's visions were affirmed, not dismissed. He was remembered as a biblical prophet, a man chosen by God to deliver his people, whose failure did not invalidate his mission, but simply meant the appointed time had not yet come. The violence of the rebellion was reinterpreted as righteous judgment, akin to the plagues of Egypt or the conquest narratives of ancient Israel. These stories were not comfortable, but they gave meaning and dignity to lives deliberately stripped of both. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838, later wrote that Nathaniel Turner's name was whispered in Maryland's slave quarters when he was a child, spoken in terror by slaveholders and reverenced by slaves. "We knew that a man had risen up," Douglass recalled, "and that gave us hope even in our darkest hours." He noted that attempts to suppress Turner's memory only magnified it, turning him into a legendary figure whose story grew with each retelling. Details became fantastical. Tales that Nathaniel could read minds, foresee the future, survive bullets, communicate with spirits. These embellishments, though historically inaccurate, served crucial psychological purposes. They transformed Nathaniel from a defeated rebel into a near-mythic presence whose power stretched beyond the reach of white authorities. The long-term impact on Virginia's slave system was profound, despite official denials. Slave patrols became more frequent, more aggressive, and more violent. Nighttime inspections of slave quarters increased, searching for forbidden objects like books, maps, or weapons. Surveillance of slave gatherings intensified dramatically. Any religious meeting required a white observer. Slaves caught traveling without written permission face immediate, severe punishment. Any sign of education or leadership ability became grounds for suspicion, often resulting in a forced sale to the Deep South, where the enslaved person would be deliberately isolated from familiar surroundings and support networks. The economic consequences were measurable. Insurance rates for enslaved men aged 15 to 40 rose by an average of 30% across Virginia and neighboring states. Plantation owners who once permitted limited freedom of movement now instituted rigid systems tracking every slave's location at all times. The added cost of maintaining control, more overseers, more patrols, more administrative oversight, reduced Virginia's overall profitability, accelerating its shift towards selling enslaved people to the Deep South rather than sustaining large plantations. Agricultural productivity in Southampton County fell noticeably in the years following the rebellion. Many of the county's most experienced field workers have been executed, sold away, or left so traumatized by the violence and its consequences that many enslaved laborers became so traumatized by the uprising and its violent aftermath that their efficiency dropped sharply. Several plantation owners abandoned Southampton County altogether, selling their land and relocating to places they considered safer. Property values plummeted and took nearly a decade to recover. These economic consequences were rarely discussed publicly because they contradicted the official narrative that the rebellion had been a brief, isolated event with no lasting impact. Ironically, the harsher restrictions that followed the uprising likely prevented future large-scale revolts by making coordinated organization almost impossible. Yet even the most oppressive laws could not erase the fear that now permeated white Southern society. The nagging suspicion that beneath the surface of apparent docility lay the potential for catastrophic violence. That fear shaped Southern culture in countless visible and invisible ways, feeding the siege mentality that ultimately contributed to secession and Civil War 3 decades later. For the enslaved population, Southampton County became a symbol, a moment when the impossible briefly became real. Nathaniel Turner's name was spoken in careful tones, often with coded language, but it was spoken. Songs began including subtle references to the rebellion. Stories were passed quietly from one generation to the next, altered by time but preserving the essential truth. Once, a man had stood up and fought back. One song that emerged in the 1840s, documented by researchers generations later, contained the lines, "Old Nat Turner, he got free / showed us all what we could be, though they caught him in the end, / freedom's got another friend." The song appeared at funerals, weddings, corn-chucking contests, any gathering where enslaved people could create a temporary cultural space away from white supervision. The lyrics varied from region to region, but the message remained constant. Nathaniel's attempt at liberation, even in failure, represented a victory of human dignity over a system built on dehumanization. The deeper evidence of the rebellion's impact surfaced in unlikely economic records. Slave insurance rates rose significantly across Virginia after 1831. Some insurers outright refused to cover enslaved men in certain age ranges. The market price for male slaves fell relative to female slaves, as buyers feared purchasing potential rebels. Laws regulating the interstate slave trade were modified to prevent importing enslaved people from northern states, where they might have encountered abolitionist sentiment. Taxes on slaves were adjusted to discourage bringing in people from Africa or the Caribbean, where revolutionary traditions were perceived as dangerously strong. The entire economic and legal architecture of slavery shifted in response to those 48 hours in Southampton County. Southern legislatures passed new restrictions explicitly referencing the recent disturbances in Virginia. South Carolina made it illegal for free black people to return to the state after leaving it. Georgia prohibited enslaved people from learning trades that could grant too much independence. Alabama outlawed all religious gatherings for enslaved people unless strictly supervised by white observers. These laws, passed hundreds of miles from Southampton, demonstrated how deeply Nathaniel Turner's rebellion had shaken the foundation of Southern slavery. In the North, abolitionists reacted with a mixture of horror and recognition. They were appalled by the violence, but understood that Nathaniel's actions represented a logical response to systemic abuse. William Lloyd Garrison had published the first issue of The Liberator in January 1831, 8 months before the rebellion. The events in Southampton County gave sudden urgency to his warnings about the inevitable consequences of maintaining slavery. Garrison's response walked a careful line. He condemned the violence, yet insisted that slavery itself had created the conditions that made such violence unavoidable. "What we have long predicted has come to pass," he wrote in September 1831. "The slaves have risen in bloody rebellion. The guilt rests not with them, but with those who have held them in chains, denying them every human right. Those who make peaceful progress impossible make violent revolution inevitable." This response enraged Southern readers. Garrison quickly became a symbol of dangerous radicalism throughout the slave states. Several states offered rewards for his capture. Georgia offered $5,000, an enormous sum, for anyone who could deliver him to stand trial for inciting insurrection. But the Southern reaction only affirmed Garrison's strategy. The rebellion forced the slavery debate into national consciousness. For many Northerners who had been indifferent or uninformed, Southampton County made the issue impossible to ignore. Newspaper accounts, even when filtered through Southern biases, revealed the brutal conditions that drove human beings to such desperate revolt. Families torn apart, relentless labor, denied education, restricted religion. The rebellion became a catalyst for rising Northern opposition to slavery's expansion, even among those who were not yet ready to advocate immediate abolition. At the same time, the rebellion pushed Southern intellectuals to fortify pro-slavery ideology. In the wake of Nathaniel Turner's uprising, they shifted from describing slavery as a necessary evil to defending it as a positive good. If enslaved people were supposedly happy and well cared for, men like Nathaniel Turner shouldn't exist. Therefore, his very existence required an ideological justification, stricter control, stronger surveillance, and a moral framework portraying slavery as benevolent. This defensive reaction reshaped Southern political and cultural life for the next 30 years, building the ideological foundation that made secession feel not only possible but necessary when Lincoln's election threatened slavery's future. So what really happened in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831? The question seems straightforward, but the answer remains contested nearly 2 centuries later. The basic facts are undisputed. There was a slave uprising. Approximately 60 white residents were killed. The rebellion was crushed, and 16 rebels were executed. But the meaning of those events, the motivations behind them, the lessons they reveal, and the truths they expose about the nation that produced them, remains a subject of enduring debate. The debate over Nathaniel Turner's legacy remains intense. Was he a religious visionary, truly convinced he was following divine commands? The evidence suggests he believed every vision he described. The consistency of his accounts, his willingness to die for his cause, his refusal to express even a trace of regret as he faced execution, all of it points to genuine conviction. But this still leaves a larger question. Were his visions mystical revelations or psychological responses to unbearable conditions? Perhaps they were both. The human mind under extreme pressure often generates the justifications needed to make sense of actions that rational thought alone would struggle to motivate. Was he instead a political revolutionary who used religion as a tool to inspire followers? His careful planning, the strategic selection of routes and targets, and his awareness of the broader political moment point to a calculating intelligence at work. The rebellion was not spontaneous. It was a coordinated military operation with defined objectives. Yet that planning doesn't negate his religious fervor. Throughout history, revolutions have often blended spiritual conviction with practical strategy. Then there's a question that haunts any serious examination of the uprising. Was the violence justified? The killing of children, of women who had shown kindness, of small farmers with no slaves and little power. How can such deaths be reconciled with any moral framework? Nathaniel's answer, echoed by many revolutionaries before and after him, was that the oppressor class could not be divided into innocent and guilty. The system itself was the enemy, and everyone who benefited from it, even passively, was complicit. This logic has justified revolutionary violence across centuries, and it remains as disturbing now as it was then. Yet the question of justification cannot be separated from the nature of slavery itself. A system that treated human beings as property, that tore families apart that enforced compliance through brutality, that denied education, autonomy, and dignity. What form of resistance would have been considered appropriate? If Nathaniel Turner's violence was unjustifiable, what form of resistance would have been justified? The historical record shows that peaceful resistance brought violence in return. Attempted escape led to torture or death. Even the smallest assertion of humanity was punished. Trial records and contemporary accounts reveal a deliberate effort to erase parts of the rebellion. The extensive support network that kept Nathaniel hidden for 6 weeks appears only in passing. The number of enslaved people who protected him with their silence is never tallied. The possibility that his revolt inspired future forms of resistance is carefully denied. These absences in the historical record speak as loudly as anything that was preserved. Thomas Gray's Confessions remains a primary source for understanding Nathaniel's motivations, yet is a profoundly flawed document. Gray had financial incentives to exaggerate, political incentives to frame the story in ways that supported slavery, and personal biases that colored every line he wrote. Reading the confession requires an awareness that we are viewing Nathaniel through multiple layers of distortion. His own self-presentation, Gray's editorial shaping, and the expectations of a white Southern audience. Yet even through all those distortions, a coherent portrait emerges, a highly intelligent man trapped in a system that refused to recognize his humanity, who channeled his rage and despair into religious certainty, who convinced himself and others that divine sanction justified horrific violence, and who followed his convictions to their final conclusion, knowing from the beginning that the path led to death. This portrait doesn't resolve the moral questions his actions raise, but it makes them intelligible in ways that simplistic narratives of madness or evil never could. Today, almost no physical evidence of the rebellion remains. The farms where the killings occurred have been rebuilt, sold, and reshaped. The hollow where Nathaniel hid has vanished into the forest floor. The courthouse where he was tried no longer stands. Even his remains were treated so brutally and scattered so completely that nothing identifiable survives. This erasure was deliberate. Virginia sought to eliminate not just a man, but any trace of him that might inspire future uprisings. But the story endured anyway. It lived on in the folk memories of enslaved communities, in the fears of the white South, in the rhetoric of abolitionists, and eventually in the historical record. Even the censored version could not fully silence it. So, what do you make of Nathaniel Turner's story? Was he a prophet, a revolutionary, a murderer, or all three at once? Leave your thoughts below. If this historical mystery captivated you, and you want to uncover more hidden stories buried in the darkest corners of American history, Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the uncomfortable truths the past still carries. Today, in Southampton County, there are no monuments to Nathaniel Turner. No plaques mark the place where the rebellion began or where it ended. The sites of his trial and execution appear only in specialized historical literature. For nearly a century after his death, even mentioning his name in public was considered dangerous. That silence speaks volumes. Events authorities want remembered are memorialized, celebrated, woven into the stories a culture tells about itself. Events they want forgotten are buried beneath layers of silence. The depth of Southampton County silence about Nathaniel Turner reveals the magnitude of the threat he represented. Not merely the physical destruction, but the ideological challenge to slavery itself. Because Nathaniel Turner had demonstrated several truths that slavery's defenders needed desperately to deny. That enslaved people were fully human, capable of complex thought and careful planning. That they understood their oppression and despised it. That they were willing to risk everything for freedom. And that the entire system of slavery depended not on loyalty or acceptance, but on force, fear, and the constant threat of violence. These truths made slavery morally indefensible, and the only possible response was to bury them as deeply as possible. The rebellion's aftershocks rippled through American history in ways both obvious and subtle. The harsher restrictions imposed on enslaved people afterward made the system even more totalizing and cruel. The fear that settled over white Southern society contributed to the paranoia and defensive posture that would eventually explode into secession in 1860. And the undeniable proof that violent resistance was not only possible but terrifyingly effective, even if it failed, shaped the calculations of abolitionists, slaveholders, and enslaved people during the decades leading to the Civil War. When Union troops occupied Southampton County during the war, elderly formerly enslaved residents told soldiers the stories they had been passing down for 30 years. Some details had blurred or grown exaggerated, but the core remained unchanged. A single man had risen up, struck terror into the hearts of the oppressor class, and shown, if only briefly, that resistance was possible. That memory sustained people through 3 more decades of bondage. It whispered that freedom was imaginable, even when the world insisted otherwise. Modern historians continue to debate Nathaniel Turner's place in American history. Some regard him as a heroic freedom fighter. Others see him as a religious extremist. Still others view him as a tragic figure whose violence was both understandable and morally unsettling. The truth likely embraces all these perspectives. Nathaniel Turner was a complex human being shaped by impossible circumstances, whose choices disturb us precisely because they defy simple moral labels. What is beyond debate is that those 48 hours in Southampton County reshaped American history. They accelerated the South's transformation of slavery from a reluctant, necessary evil into a fully defended, positive good. They strengthened the abolitionist movement by exposing slavery's brutality and the desperate desire for freedom among the enslaved. They influenced the development of slave control systems across the Americas, as other slaveholding regions studied Virginia's crackdown and copied its methods. And they proved, beyond any hope of denial, that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for white saviors. They were agents in their own struggle, willing to seize freedom by force when every other avenue was closed. This truth was too dangerous to acknowledge publicly, so it was buried beneath propaganda, legal restrictions, and deliberate forgetting. But it could never be fully erased. Too many people had witnessed it. Too many lives had been shaped by its implications. Southampton County, Virginia, August 1831 was a moment when the core contradictions of the United States became impossible to ignore. A nation founded on liberty, built on bondage. A Christian society that justified unchristian cruelty. A democratic republic that denied basic humanity to a vast portion of its population. These contradictions could only be maintained through violence, surveillance, and systematic denial, and Nathaniel Turner exposed their fragility. The rebellion failed in its immediate goals. Jerusalem was never reached. No general uprising followed, Slavery endured for another 34 years. But the fear the revolt generated, the questions it raised, and the proof it provided that the slave system could be challenged, these effects rippled forward, contributing to the rising tensions that would eventually tear the country apart and force the nation to confront the injustice at its center. In the final analysis, the story America never wanted to tell about Nathaniel Turner is not just a tale of his revolt and its brutal suppression. It is a larger truth revealed by his actions, the violence required to sustain slavery, the fear that haunted slaveholding society, the desperate courage of those who resisted, and the lengths to which authorities would go to suppress not only rebellion, but the memory of rebellion. The documents survive: trial records, newspaper accounts, Thomas Gray's confession, letters and diaries from the people who lived through those events. But for generations, they were treated as dangerous artifacts, locked away in archives where they could not inspire dangerous ideas. History, written by the victors, was shaped to serve their interests and stripped of its most unsettling implications. Yet the truth persisted in the silences, in the anxious glances white Southerners cast toward enslaved people, in the whispered songs of the quarters, in the tightening of controls that betrayed ongoing fear. Southampton County, August 1831. 2 days that changed everything while officially changing nothing. A rebellion crushed but never forgotten. A story buried but never erased. That is the truth America never wanted told. Not simply that Nathaniel Turner led a slave rebellion, but that he proved slavery could exist only through terror, that he exposed a lie at the heart of the system, and that his actions, however morally troubling they remained, were the inevitable outcome of an institution so fundamentally unjust that violence was its only possible consequence. Authorities executing Nathaniel Turner mutilated his body and tried to erase his memory, but they could not erase the questions he forced the nation confront, questions that would ultimately require a civil war to answer.